I don't know about you all, but it excites me to see our young ones up here leading in worship and playing their instruments. Praise God. What a blessing. What a blessing. Our title this morning, An Unlikely Affection. I'm going to take this title and I'm going to use it two different ways in the next 2 weeks, so I hope you're looking forward to what we did. Last week we talked about lawlessness and its connection to love. And when lawlessness abounds, it has a tendency to diminish love. But when love abounds, it will diminish lawlessness. Amen? So we're continuing to this topic of love here this morning. An unlikely affection. If you have your Bibles, I'm going to ask you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 18, and we'll pretty much stick in chapter 18 for the most part this morning. So I'm going to ask you to turn there and stay there, and we'll take a look at this idea of an unlikely affection here. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1. Now it came about, when he had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Father, I thank you for the privilege that we have to gather together and to worship you, and to testify that you live, and I know you live because of what you've done in my heart. And to know that you do new things, and you take this broken heart of mine, and you make it new. You can take the broken pieces of our lives, God, and you can do something beautiful with them. And that all glory and all honor belong to you. Speak to us this morning. Let your presence be here. In Jesus' name. Amen. Chapter 18, believe it or not, comes right on the heels of the end of chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. I'm a math teacher, y'all know, right? Well, you see, in chapter 17, David had just slain Goliath. And as a young lad, he just cut off the head of a 9-foot giant and brought it back into Jerusalem with the head in tow. And Saul says, "Who is that young man?" So they go out and they bring David into Saul's presence. And Saul says, "Where do you come from? What family are you from?" And he tells him, and it's from the, Bethlehem, from Jesse, his father. And then we find chapter 18, verse 1. When Jonathan is standing there in the presence of his father, the king, and David, who just knew Goliath, something stirred inside of Jonathan's heart. And there was nothing impure, there was nothing ungodly. It was a sincere, honest love that he had for his friend. And we'll see that, especially next week. We'll be talking about the affection that David and Jonathan shared. But this week, we're going to look at Saul. And we're going to tie these two men and their affections to David and parallel it to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And we're going to see how the truth in the New Testament played out in this storyline in the Old Testament. So I hope you're looking forward to this, and let the Lord speak to all of our hearts here this morning. So in order to begin, I'm going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, but we're going to look at the end of verse 4 to the beginning of verse 6. 1 Corinthians 13, 4 to 6 says, "Love is not jealous. Love does not brag, and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account the wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness." So those are the collections of the love is nots in 1 Corinthians 13. And we're going to see how they parallel with the life of Saul, and perhaps even get a glimpse into Saul's heart, why he was the way he was. It's very interesting. So here we go. The first thing we see about Saul in chapter 18, verse 8 and 9 of 1 Samuel is the comment that he makes when he says, "Then Saul became angry for this saying displeased him, and he said, before we finish that verse, see, when David had conquered or killed Goliath and they conquered the Philistines, Saul began to send David out with the army. Now, David was still a young lad. How young? Some say as young as 16, maybe as old as early 20s. That's still pretty young to be fighting men who have trained their whole lives towards battle. But Saul was sending David out with the army. And David was victorious in everything he put his hand to. So when they would come back into the cities, now when coming back from battle, there would be a huge parade down the street of the city, and the people would come out and cheer, and typically they would parade the defeated king. They would parade some of the plunder that they gathered from that war up the streets of the city, and Saul, of course, would be leading it. Why? Because he's the king of Israel. And when the people were coming out, the women were singing and shouting and playing their tambourines and their cymbals. They were singing a song. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Wow. Well, this ticked the king off a little bit. Why? Because this little runt is being elevated before him. So go on in 1 Samuel 18:8. And Saul said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? Wow. Now, we're going to see some narcissistic tendencies that play out in Saul's life. And it goes all the way back to before this time period that he had a tendency toward those things. And if you've ever been associated closely or especially have worked underneath the you know what I mean, and the narcissistic person, I may have just made that word up.
Like the math.
Yeah, I'm a math teacher. You know, you've been through those battles. Well, here we see these tendencies. So Saul is jealous because David's getting more glory than he is. Now, Saul did a good job defeating the Philistines and the Amalekites, but David was getting more glory than him. And that had a tendency, we see here, to really get under Saul's skin. Verse 9, and Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Saul was jealous of David because David was getting more glory than Saul was, right? What does 1 Corinthians 13 say? Love is not jealous. Go ahead to the next slide there. As a matter of fact, that's the first thing that knots in 1 Corinthians bring out. It's not jealous. And the first real act in Saul's life here against David is the fact that he was jealous because David was getting more glory than him. That's not love. It's not love playing out. It's not love in any way, shape, or form. It's very selfishness that we find in King Saul here. So the next thing we see is in verse 10 of 1 Samuel chapter 18. As we're playing along here in the storyline, now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the home while David was playing the harp with his hand. So here we see Saul raging and having a temper tantrum in the house as David was playing harp. Now, the whole thing about this evil spirit from God, I don't have a good answer for you at this point. We really don't have enough scripture to understand exactly what that means in the original language there. But the fact that we see Saul raging in his home as David was playing a harp. See, David, as a younger lad, was brought to the palace, and Saul didn't remember him. But David would come and play his harp and soothe Saul's temper tantrums. And now, coming back into the palace, again, David begins playing the harp and soothing Saul's rage. So, but we see that he is just livid. You know, the face is red, the fangs are showing, and he's drooling. The whole picture of kind of the way Saul is behaving in his rage toward David. And what does 1 Corinthians say about this topic here? love does not act unbecomingly. Love is not jealous. Love does not act unbecomingly. You have a problem with your temper? You have a problem with jealousy? You kind of fly off the handle at the drop of a hat? You're playing into the hand of the same spirit here that we find in the life of Saul, the king of Israel. And it's totally contrary to the way we should be behaving, and yet we see here this king of Israel, word for word, is playing out in this evil that is building up in his heart. Isn't that interesting? How that's playing. I really found that myself here. Well, let's jump in 1 Samuel to chapter 20 for a moment. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 30 and 31, and we'll see the next characteristic of what love is not. 1 Samuel 20, verse 30. Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan. Now, the background here is Jonathan was trying to protect David. And Jonathan was trying to bring David into a new light in Saul's eyes because of Saul's hatred for him was so great. He wasn't really seeing who David was. So Jonathan was defending David. This makes Saul mad. Not only mad at David, but mad at his own son, the crowned prince of Israel. He's next in line to the throne. It's Jonathan who would take the nation when his father Saul dies, according to the custom and the way things should have been done. All right? This is the way Saul sees it. And because David is a threat to their family line of kingship, that this anger is burning within Saul. And when Jonathan defends David, it's just making the whole problem worse. And that's why Saul said in verse 30, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" And basically what he said is to the mother who gave you birth, you're bringing shame to her. Don't you see, Jonathan, what you're doing? Don't you understand here? Because in verse 31 he goes on, "For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established." So we see here the heart of Saul. He's livid about this fact that David has to die because David will get a throne from Jonathan if he gives him a chance. Now let's back up in history a little bit. Because Saul has already been rejected as king. Twice now, when they were going against the Philistines in the beginning of Saul's reign, he gathered the army at Gilgal. And Samuel the prophet was supposed to come and offer an offering there on the mountain at Gilgal before they go into battle. Well, 7 days go by. No Samuel. So the armies are getting a little restless there. The soldiers are kind of wondering and beginning a little nervous here. So Saul is going to take matters into his own hands. He thinks, I've got to get some confidence back in my men. I've got to make sure we're ready to go here. So Saul himself offers the sacrifice. That was Samuel's job, the prophet of God. So Samuel shows up, and the offering is going on. And Samuel says, "What's going on here?" And Saul tries to work his way backward out of the situation. But the problem was he was trying to take matters into his own hands. And then if we fast forward a little bit in time, Israel was supposed to go against the Amalekites. Not only fight against them, they were supposed to annihilate them. The Amalekites go all the way back to pre-promised land times, when it was the Amalekites that were fighting against Moses and the nation of Israel way back then. And now it's time to battle them again. And Samuel tells Saul, "Don't leave nothing alive. Kill everyone, kill the animals, do not take any plunder, it does not belong to you." But Saul takes matters into his own hands. They kill the soldiers, for sure. But look, those are pretty good slaves out there. Let's bring the women and the children. and the king. Let's bring the king so I can parade him through the streets of the city so the people can praise me and see how glorious I was in battle. Well, look at all these animals here, all this livestock. Can't let that go to waste, can we? So Saul brings all this stuff after conquering the army, and he's all proud of himself, and up comes Samuel. And Saul is like, we did it, we conquered them, we're victorious over the Amalekites. And Samuel says, well, what's that bleating that I hear in my ears, the sheep and the cows and the goats? Well, Samuel said, you disobeyed the word of the Lord. You are now rejected as king of Israel. So all of this happens before the whole David and Goliath storyline. And Samuel actually goes to Bethlehem and goes to the house of Jesse and goes through all of his big, handsome, strong sons and comes to the last itty-bitty little one out in the field taking care of the sheep. And that's the one God chooses to be the next king of Israel. So the whole story has already been set. God has already decided Saul will not be king any longer, and his descendants will not reign on the throne, but David's will. So here we see Saul now, in the future, speaking to his son, the crowned prince, and saying, you fool, don't you understand? As long as David is alive, your throne is in jeopardy, and so is your heritage. But when God determines something, who's going to stop it? When God decides this is the way things are going to be, who's going to speak different from that? Saul didn't care what God said. Saul had no interest in what God was saying or what God had decided. Saul only knew what Saul wanted, and Saul was going to get it at every cost. Saul was jealous, was he not? Saul was raging and let his temper flare out of control. Saul was acting unbecomingly. What's the next thing we find in 1 Corinthians about what love is not? Okay? And it says, love does not seek its own. Love does not seek its own. And we're finding Saul fitting perfectly into every category of what real love is not. So why the title? An unlikely affection. For this week, it's unlikely that Saul is going to have any affection for David. Right? I don't see it happening unless something happens in Saul's life. And something will happen, believe it or not, down the road. But it won't change the storyline. Okay. Back to chapter 18. Back to chapter 18 of 1 Samuel. Remember, we left off at the beginning of verse 10. Saul was raging while David was playing the harp, as usual. And a spear was in Saul's hand. What's going to happen? Verse 11. And Saul hurled the spear. Well, he thought, I'll pin David to the wall. Wow. Now, Jojo and Caleb used to throw spears at each other and arrows at each other and stuff like that, but it was in love. They were brothers, right? I don't think that was the intent of Saul here. Saul's heart, and notice the scriptures beginning to tell us, his intent was to pin David to the wall. Now, these aren't little wooden sticks that Jojo and Caleb whittled and threw at each other. These things were huge, oak-handled, heavy, metal-tipped spears that will penetrate through a man and pin him right to a tree. This was nothing little. And Saul's heart was to do this to David himself. So what does the Bible teach us about love? Love is not provoked. Love is not provoked. You see here, go ahead and next slide, boy. We see here that Saul's anger and his rage became so great that it provoked him to this evil act. And not only did he let his temper flare out of control, but he acted upon that temper. And he attempted to murder David on that very day. It says David escaped out of his grasp. Twice that day, David escaped out of what Saul tried to kill him in this manner here. Phew. Okay, back to our story. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 7. 1 Samuel 18:7. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter, Merab." Now, hold on a second here. Saul had an oldest daughter, Merab, and he wanted David to marry his oldest daughter, but his oldest daughter didn't really love David. And David wasn't really interested in his oldest daughter. Okay? So, Saul's intention was not, well, perhaps I could bring David into the family, and perhaps we can calm this whole, no. Because we find out that the rest of the verse there, as it goes on to say, I will give her to you as a wife, only you valiant man for me, and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, my hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. Wow. You know, David was in front of the eyes of all the people. He was being praised and gloried. And here Saul thought, man, I can't kill David. And all these people can think bad about me. So what I'll do is I'll send David in battle, and I'll let the Philistines kill him. I'll be done with my issue. My hands are washed clean. Look at how innocent I am. But he's trapping David, trying to marry him off to Saul's wife. David doesn't buy into it. David doesn't marry her. But Michal, his younger daughter, is in love with David. And so Merab is married to somebody else. Michal is promised to David now. Let's see what happens in verse 21. And Saul thought, I will give her to him, that she may become a snare to him. Wow. You talking about conniving. And we're seeing, I don't know how or why, but we're getting a glimpse into the thought processes of Saul in this storyline here. And he's thinking, I can marry my younger daughter, and she'll become a snare to David. And that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David for a second time, you may be my son-in-law today. Wow. This is really conniving to try to accomplish the rage and satisfy the anger and the bitterness and the hatred within his heart against this man. So he's offering his children as fodder in this battle. Drop down, verse 25. Saul then said, David said about Michal, he said, I'm a poor man. I come from a poor family. I have no dowry to offer the king for his daughter's hand here. So Saul says, okay, go up and kill 100 Philistines and bring me one of their body parts back. We'll talk about which one. Bring me 100 of them back, and that'll be your dowry for my wife. So what does David do? He goes out and gets 200 of them and brings that particular body part back in the bag to the king for the dowry for his daughter's hand there. Anyway, verse 25 goes on to say, to take vengeance on the king's enemies. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Surely if I send David against 100 Philistines, they're going to kill him. Right? David brings back twice that many. But what's Saul's intent? So Saul is thinking, he's conniving, he's planning. What does Paul say to the Corinthian church about what love is? Love does not seek evil. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Love does not seek evil, or does not rejoice in unrighteousness. Which is what he's doing, is he not? He's plotting, he's planning these evil things. And we're seeing here Paul's writing to the Corinthians playing out word for word in the life of King Saul over the nation of Israel in that day and time. But in that, doesn't that give us kind of a little bit of a glimpse into our own heart? He was seeking evil. He was rejoicing in unrighteousness. And no, if you're not sure about this, plotting to murder somebody is not a good thing, okay? I don't think in the Bible it's a righteous act. And here, that's what he was doing here. He was plotting unrighteousness. Well, none of us are guilty of that. Good. Well, hold on a second. Didn't Jesus say, if you hate your brother without a cause, you're guilty of murder? He set a really high standard, did he not? And seeking unrighteousness is not just this wicked act of murder, but doesn't it account for so many other areas that we find in our life? How about speaking evil of someone? How about plotting? Or how about passing along rumors that we know aren't true, or we're not sure that they're true? Isn't that fit under the same spirit? Doesn't that go against the teaching that this is not what love is? True love. The God kind of love. The agape love, the Greek word that we know is to love, is to protect, and to provide. It has nothing to do with your lust. It has nothing to do with your emotions. It has nothing to do with your feelings. It's to protect and to provide even at the cost of your own life. Greater love has no man than this, than a man lays down his life for his friend. So we're seeing here that Saul, the king, is playing out perfectly and showing us what Paul means in his letter to the Corinthians there. Saul was seeking evil. What I like about this storyline, that's unlike many of the others in the scriptures, we get into the heart, into the motives of why Saul is doing what he's doing. Saul thought, I can get the Philistines to kill David and do my dirty work for me. Saul thought, I can get my daughter to be a snare for David and to trap him and get him out of my way, get him from my problems here. Isn't it interesting that love, as well as the opposite of love, comes from the heart? It comes from the inside. Our actions and our outward treatment of each other, that ends up being just the final result of what starts in here a long way down the road. For Saul, it was when those people were giving David more glory than when they were giving him the king of Israel. And he started becoming jealous. And you notice the progression in the severity of these issues seem to be progressively getting worse and worse, don't they? So that this jealousy and this rage and this provokedness is now turning into seeking opportunities to do evil in this man's life. It's very unlikely that Saul had any affection for David. But what's even neater, not that it's really a good story, but neater about the story is the fact that we now get to the motive. What is it really that's causing Saul to be jealous, that's causing him to rage, that's causing him to be provoked and to work out these acts of unrighteousness? What is it in his heart that started all of this to begin with? We get to the motive. And the scriptures give us his motive, why he's doing what he's doing. Isn't that interesting? Back to 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 12. 1 Samuel 18:12. Now Saul was afraid of David. What's that one common core issue in Saul's heart? Fear. He was afraid of David. Why? The verse goes on to say, for the Lord was with him, and had already departed from Saul. When Saul disobeyed, went on Mount Gilgal, and he offered that that offering before Samuel had a chance to get there. The presence of God departed from Saul at that point. That's why they brought David in to play the harp, to soothe him when he got into his rages. And then, when he didn't wipe out the Amalekites like he was supposed to, he was rejected as king. And here we see that he saw in David's life God working. He saw God blessing him. Everything David set his hand to, it just grated on Saul more and more, and he became fearful because David now had the blessing that he once had as king of Israel. Fear was that motivator. Drop down to verse 29 of chapter 18. Then Saul was even more afraid of David. Wow. That fear grew, that fear fermented and sprouted in Saul's heart, and it grew and became a monster in his life. And that fear is what motivated the jealousy and the rage and the provokedness and the evil thinking. It all goes back to Saul was afraid. What was he afraid of? He was afraid of losing his position. He was afraid of losing his kingship. He was afraid of losing his kingdom to his son and his son's sons. Saul became afraid because he saw God working in David's life, and he was no longer working in his life. And that's the engine that drove all of these other actions. Fear. Fear is an enemy to believers in Jesus Christ. Fear is something that will paralyze us. Fear is something that will cause us not to step out and to do the work that God has called us to do. We're afraid, or it'll motivate us into these other non-love characteristics. To Timothy, Paul's disciple, don't let anyone knock you down because of your young age. But he goes on to say in chapter 1 of verse 7 of 2 Timothy, he says this, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear." That's not the way God works. Nothing about fear has anything to do with what God is doing. The Spirit of God does not operate in fear. And if we're working and being motivated in fear, then we're stepping outside of God's plan. Perhaps we're beginning to offer the sacrifice on the altar and not waiting for the prophet. Or perhaps we're being motivated to disobey and parade our victories for the people. Look at Saul's motives. Why did he offer that offering before Samuel got there? Because he was afraid because the men were becoming restless. They waited 7 days, a whole week, and the prophet hadn't shown up yet. The Philistines are gathering there. Their army looks serious, and my men are starting to waver a little bit. I've got to bring them together. Right? Fear motivated his decision. And then when he refused to annihilate the Amalekites, why did he keep the king? So he could parade that king down the middle of the street so everybody can say, look at Saul, he conquered the king of the Amalekites. Look at the plunder. And Saul will get his glory. He was afraid of losing his position in the eyes of the people. He was afraid that the people would not see him as the king he wanted to be shown at. Everything Saul done was motivated by fear. But God has not given us a spirit of fear. What has he given us? What has God provided for us that we don't have to operate in fear? Power, love, and a sound mind. Instead of operating like Saul was, God says, don't do that. Don't live that way. This is what I have for you. This is the way I want you to live. I want you to understand that the same power that raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you. The whole Godhead in his completeness is inside of a believer in Jesus Christ. Love. Love does not fail. We'll look at next week in 1 Corinthians 13. Love does not fail. Wow. What a phrase. What a beautiful thought of the power and the potential of loving with a God kind of love. It will not fail. Ever. It's an eternal word. And finally, peace. Peace. A sound mind. A calm spirit. No matter what's going on in the past, no matter where you come from, no matter what background you have, God doesn't want us to live in fear. He wants us to live in power, in love, and in peace, in calmness, and joy. All of these things are from within. They're not determined by external circumstances. Saul was motivated by external circumstances around him. David being praised by the people. The people lifting David up. David conquering Goliath. And Saul was looking around at everything that's going around him. He said, now I'm losing my position. I'm losing my authority. I'm losing my glory here. I've got to do something. And he starts acting in his own strength, and his own thoughts, and his own wisdom. And look where it gets him. Well, that's good preaching. I don't know about you all. I'm stepping all over my toes today. All right. This is what God has given us. So we see the motivation of fear here. There's a very, very wise philosopher that I want to quote here this morning. To the dark side, reach here. Right? Even in Star Wars, they get the idea that this is where fear leads to. There's nothing godly about fear. Paul said, be anxious for nothing, but in everything with prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. We see the play out of this characteristic here. Philippians 4. Be anxious for nothing. Go ahead and do that. Philippians 4, 6 and 7. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Check this out here. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding or comprehension. It goes far beyond our ability to grasp where this thing came from and how it works. But it's that shalom. It's that peace that comes upon us in the middle of the storm. In the same way that Jesus calmed the storm with those disciples out there, fearing for their lives, that same peace, he can calm the storm in our lives. That same peace that he offers, it won't remove the external circumstances, most likely, but it'll give us peace in the midst of those circumstances. And that peace, what will it do for us? It'll guard that heart. It'll take care of us. It'll cause us. Well, I don't need to go there. Fill in the blanks. All right. So that was. It's very unlikely, right, that Saul will ever have affection for David. Saul is in a cave chasing David with his army to kill David. And he goes into the cave to take a nap. True story. Okay. And while Saul is sleeping, his guards are at the doorway to the cave, and Saul is safe inside the cave. Nobody can get to him, except David happened to be inside the cave at that time. And his men were like, there's Saul, go kill him. And even at that point, when David had an opportunity to kill Saul and take the throne, because it was his anyway, he says, I'm not going to do it my way, I'm going to do it God's way. So he goes up and he slips a corner of Saul's robe off of him. And Saul wakes up and he goes out the cave, and as he's walking away to his army, David comes out of the cave holding that piece of material. God delivered you into my hand today, but I refuse to harm you because you are the king of Israel right now. All of these opportunities, David said, I've had to kill you, and you've done nothing but harm me. You chased me down. You tried to do everything you can to remove me, and I've done nothing but honor you and do good to you. So David presents himself to Saul, presents the truth of the situation, and how Saul has been treating him, and Saul is broken. And Saul sees that David did not kill him. He sees everything David has just said is true, and he cries out, David, is that you, my son? Wow. David continued to love Saul to the end. And God broke Saul's heart. Saul quit chasing David at that point. Saul quit trying to kill David at that point. Saul will die soon in the story here. We'll see next week. But before he does, reconciliation with David was made. Why? Not because Saul was good, not because Saul did it right, but because David did it right, even when he was being done wrong. Where are you at? How do you fit into this story? Perhaps your rage gets out of control. Perhaps you get jealous because God seems to be doing something with somebody else and not with you, or somebody else seems to be more blessed than you. Is any of these characteristics that played out in Saul's life playing out in your life? If there is, and I guarantee you, because none of us are perfect, I bet you we can go through each one of us and we can pick out characteristics that we're emulating Saul in. We need to repent of those things. We need to lay them at the foot of the cross and say, Jesus, forgive me. I see this in myself. Help me to follow you. Help me to turn away from this. Help me to love, because love will not fail. I'm going to ask you to stand this morning. As always, I pray that God has spoken to your heart. And if he speaks to your heart, it's necessary that you respond back. Just to say, oh, God, thank you for talking to me. I heard a neat phrase in our men's Bible study I love. It says, we're not called to sacks. We're not called to be called to sacks. We're not to be the end of the road that receives all the blessings. We're to be a thoroughfare, and we're to allow the blessings of God to flow through us to other people. What a beautiful thought. This morning here, if there's something that you need to turn over to God, I challenge you, do it this morning. You can do it right there in your pew. You can do it up here at the altar. You can do it. Just do it. Whatever God's speaking to your heart. Let's sing here this morning.